With the effort to repeal and replace Obamacare still stalled on Capitol Hill, some welcome news from the Food and Drug Administration, which is on target to approve a record number of generic drugs this year, a move that could lower the cost of prescription medicine for millions of patients across the country. I spoke with FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb earlier. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, welcome. First time you've been back here since you've been in the government. I want to talk about your very energetic agenda and start with generic approval, drug approvals. You've been making that a priority to improve competition against branded drugs. What's making the difference?
Right. Well, we don't do drug pricing at FDA, but we do increase competition by facilitating access to more drugs, right, particularly on the generic drug side. So one of the things we're looking at is ways that we can bring more generic drugs to the market. We see particular situations where there are market failures, in my view, policies that are preventing generics from coming onto the market. So, for example, we've seen generic drug companies have obstacles getting access to the doses they need to actually do the studies in order to qualify for FDA approval because of things the branded companies do to prevent them from getting the physical drugs they need.
But they're supposed to make those samples available, and sometimes I've been told that they use FDA safety as an excuse not to provide those samples. What can you do to stop that?
Right. Well, there's things we can do. So these are risk management plans that we put in place to protect certain drugs that are risky to use, to put in place certain measures to make it safer to use drugs that have certain risks associated with them.
Right.
And branded companies use those plans as ways to block the ability of generic companies to go into the market and buy the doses they need. They need between 1,500 and 5,000 doses to actually do what's called a bioequivalence study. That's the study they need to do to prove sameness,
right,
to get approved. So the branded companies use those measures as a way to block them from getting access. We believe in market-based pricing, but in order for market-based pricing to work, the expectation is that there's going to be vigorous competition once intellectual property has lapsed on these branded drugs. So if the branded companies are deploying tactics to prevent that competition from coming on the market, that's where we're focusing our attention.
Okay, a couple of other priorities you've written for us over the years in private life. One is to overall improve drug approvals, but also make public when the FDA rejects something. Make that letter of rejection public so people can see the reason. And what progress are you making?
Right, those are the complete response letters that explain the rationale why the agency rejected a drug. We're looking at places we can increase transparency. There are certain steps we're going to take in coming months. I don't want to give you too much.
You don't want to make any news here? Come on, we'll take it.
We're going to probably be making public more of the data associated with drug approval so people have access to some of the underlying data that went into the decisions we made to approve drugs. That's probably the first step we're going to take.
Okay.
But there'll be additional steps to increase transparency around the overall review process.
All right, Congress has passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which is supposed to give you a chance at the FDA to look at classic randomized clinical trials and say, how can we introduce more evidence, perhaps, into these trials to provide faster approvals and access to more patients? How's progress going on that?
I think it's going well. I mean, there's this false dichotomy in Washington that there's a choice between speed versus safety. If you speed up the process, you're making it less safe. I think that that's not true. I think you can make the process smarter and more efficient, learn actually more, but also make it go more quickly. And that's what we're trying to focus on. How do we build in place better rules, better science, so that we can have a more efficient process overall? And the legislation gives us some tools to do that.
Well, particularly in this world where drugs now more and more are going to be patient-specific. They're smaller pools of patients that they can hit. So they might work for those people, but not for the larger pool of a randomized trial. Don't you have to start to change trials to be able to meet that kind of change in medicine?
And we're doing that. So something we announced very recently is we're going to allow for approvals on the basis of a molecular target. So let's say a drug treats a certain target that drives a lot of different cancers. The cancer might arise in the lung or the liver or the pancreas. Rather than having to get approval for the cancer in the lung and then separately approval for the cancer in the liver, if the drug works against a molecular target that drives all those cancers, you could do one trial and get approval across all the different tumor types. So that's an example of how we're trying to adapt the rules for the way drugs are being developed.
All right, that's fascinating. Now, there's also something moving through Congress called the Right to Try legislation, passed the Senate. House is going to consider it, and 30 states, I think, have passed some version of it. It basically would give patients who are dying, looking for treatment, that give them faster access to an experimental treatment. Are you in favor of that?
Look, I favor things that are going to allow patients to get more access to drugs on a compassionate use basis. I also favor things that are going to compress the development process itself so that these drugs can reach the market more efficiently. So we're looking at both things. We're going to take some steps in the coming months that I think will help facilitate the the ability of patients to get drugs on what we call compassionate use IND. That's basically the ability to use a drug that's still experimental. So we're going to take some steps on our own. Congress might pass this legislation. It looks like it has a good chance of passing.
Well, I think some of the frustration patients has is you have some compassionate use ability now, but it's very difficult sometimes, particularly if the obstacle of efficacy of the drug is put in front of patients as opposed to safety. I understand safety. You want to make sure that you're not killing patients with a drug. But in the efficacy ground, why not, if somebody's dying, isn't it immoral to deny them access to an experimental treatment?
Well, we do that now. So some of the expanded access that you see right now are situations where the efficacy isn't well established for these drugs, but there is some minimum data around the safety, and there's a plausible reason to think the drug might work. I think one of the bigger obstacles is there's not a lot of availability. A lot of companies don't make these drugs available. We want to bring more transparency to that. So I want to find ways to try to create more incentives for companies to do this and publicize it a little bit more. I think that there'll be some pressure on companies.
How can you do that? How can you, I mean, obviously you can't force the companies to provide it, but what do you do?
Well, one thing that we're going to do is make it very easy to ascertain when a company does and doesn't make a drug available so people will know. I think that kind of transparency is going to help. There's been legislation that's looked at trying to compel companies to make drugs available if the companies are going to be the recipient of certain benefits like an accelerated approval. If a drug could qualify for accelerated approval, it's a big enough breakthrough to get those kinds of benefits and concessions on behalf of by the agency. Why not also ask the company to make the drug available on an expanded access basis for people who have no medical options? And so Congress has looked at that legislatively. We couldn't do that as a matter of policy. It would take Congress.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, for being here. Sure.